and welcome to our webinar today. We're very happy to have all of those in attendance. My name is Dusty Gallagher. I'm a staff member of Eversole Associates who works both with the United States Culture Collection Network and the Phytobiomes Alliance. I'm just going to do a brief introduction of those organizations, and then we'll go over a few housekeeping items, and then I'll introduce our speakers for today. So I'd like to just give you a brief overview of the United States Culture Collection Network. It is a NSF-funded research coordination network that works to bring together scientists to facilitate the safe and responsible utilization of microbial resources for research, education, industry, medicine, and agriculture to the betterment of mankind. This network has been around since 2011, and we're very close to launching phase 2 of the network. And our hope is that in phase 2, we will begin to expand the number of collections that we represent, as well as increase the activities of the network. The Phytobiomes Alliance, who is also co-hosting this webinar today, is the International Alliance for Phytobiomes Research. And they are a nonprofit consortium of industry, academia, and governmental scientists. And they work together to promote the concept of a phytobiome, which is the complex system of plant-based agriculture. So their focus is on bringing together the different biomes within plant agriculture, those site-specific environments that are influenced by management practices in order to enhance the system-based approach. So we're very happy to be joining together these organizations to bring you the webinar today. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin. I'd like you to draw your attention to the control panel that is likely at the top right-hand portion of your screen. There's 3 aspects of this control panel that we would like for you to utilize today. The first, there is a questions menu and a little side-facing arrow that you can use to ask questions of the presenters today. So anytime you have a question during the session, please type it into this section, and then we will cover that at the end of the presentation. We'd like for you to specifically use this question section for questions directly related to the presentation and the subject matter discussed. There is also a chat feature. This can be used to interact with other members that have joined us on the webinar today. You can type in comments to the entire audience, or you can select, if you see a colleague that you would like to correspond with, you can select a private message to that prospective colleague. And then the last section is there is a handout section. And we have already uploaded 2 documents to this section. The first is a PDF of the presentation given today. And then the second is a scientific editorial about our discussion. So we invite you to take a look at those handouts. They will also be available on the USCCN website, which is usccn.org. This webinar is being recorded, and we will also post the entire webinar to a YouTube channel that is relative to USCCN. So if you go onto YouTube, type in USCCN, then you will find this webinar in its entirety. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome our presenters today. We have Scott Miller and David Schindel. They're both with the Office of the Undersecretary for Science and Research with the Smithsonian Institution. Scott is the chief scientist and David is a research associate, and they will be discussing the economic analysis of cost and benefits in scientific collections. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Scott and David to begin the discussion.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here today as one of the co-chairs of the U.S. Federal Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections. And I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the IWGSC is. Next slide. The IWGSC was created in 2005 by the White House Science Office, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And it is part of the National Science and Technology Council, which is the system of interagency committees that support the federal government science enterprise and help to coordinate it. As such, it is a group of government agencies and departments, and it covers scientific collections that the federal government either owns or funds. So our first product was in 2009, the so-called Green Report, which was really a status report on the nature and status of the government's interest in scientific collections. And it had 7 recommendations, and I'll comment further on a couple of those here. Next slide. And in 2011, Congress actually adopted 3 of the IWGSC recommendations into law as part of the America Competes Act of 2010. And then we spent a few years on behalf of OSTP helping the member federal agencies and departments to upgrade or create their collections management policies. And in 2005, we launched a clearinghouse that makes those accessible online. It is hosted by the USDA's National Agriculture Library and available online. And we also launched a registry of U.S. federal collections as part of a broader registry of scientific collections, which is actually now managed by the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Next slide. The scope of our activities include all kinds of scientific collections, that is, materials that are kept for their primarily for their scientific value as opposed to their historic or other kind of value. Our 2 biggest constituents are what you might think of as traditional natural history museum kinds of collections, as well as human biomedical collections. But we take in all forms of collections, including moon rocks and rock cores and microbial collections, and even building materials that are studied for their sort of engineering properties. Next slide. One of the things that we've done throughout the IWGSC history is really focused on getting the US government to adopt scientific collections as infrastructure in law and policy. And we've been actually pretty successful at that. I won't go into to all of the details of that, but basically scientific collections are now certainly recognized as research and development infrastructure. Next slide. And just to recap a few of the recent and current activities of the IWGSC, we're actually now organizationally placed in the NSTC Committee on Science and Technology Enterprise, which reflects the role of collections as science infrastructure. We are continuing to help federal agencies to refine and update the collections management policies. We have worked with ORCID and various other organizations in the linked data environment to try to make collections data more interlinked and accessible. We're working with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility in hosting the Global Registry of Scientific Collections, which includes those federal collections. We've worked with a number of organizations on promoting the importance of collections in the bioeconomy. For example, the National Academy's study on the bioeconomy that was published last year. In 2019, we did a workshop with National Defense University, which I'll comment on in the next slide. And in 2020, we released the economic model study, which David Schindel will describe in detail next, because he was the person who led that study. And this year we are working on an update to that green report on the sort of overall status and importance of those federal scientific collections. Next slide. As I mentioned, in 2019, the IWGSC with some other partners and the National Defense University held a workshop on essentially the interface between the traditional scientific collections community and the biodefense and biosecurity threats community, and what next generation sequencing and other technologies is doing to sort of change that interface, and particularly in things like microbes and things like select agents. How does our current understanding of sequencing even change the concept of what is a species? I won't go into detail here, but for those interested in microbial collections, the report could be interesting and is available publicly online. So with that, I will let David launch into the details of the economic study.
Thanks very much, Scott, and thanks to the organizers for their interest in the study and in the interagency working group. This report is all about federal collections, and it's based on discussions coming from people involved in federal collections. But Scott and I want to underline the fact that the issues at hand, the costs and benefits stemming from collections, really apply to non-federal collections as well. We recognize that the breadth of collections that we use in the federal working group are beyond what any individual collection includes. But we think that that just makes the findings in this report more robust and more widely applicable. So as Scott said, the working group and the report considers scientific disciplines from microbes to moon rocks. As long as they are object-based, we don't cover archives of documents unless those documents are directly linked to an object in the collection. And the report has case studies and examples, all of which are drawn from federal collections, and you'll appreciate in the report the breadth of collections we address. The working group that created this study was made up of scientists, economists, collection managers, policy and budget people, all from federal collections, although we did have some non-federal people who gave presentations and really enriched our discussions. The core of the report is the description of methods for projecting costs and documenting benefits of what we call institutional collections. I'll define that in a minute. The report also discusses cost recovery through user fees and some of the incentives, good and bad, that sets up. And finally, the report includes recommendations and a discussion of the implications for evidence-based management and policies by collection managers and by agencies. The report assumes that cost of collections is meant the net cost, that is the operating costs and the opportunity costs on the negative side relative to the benefits generated. Despite the difficulty of putting a dollar value on benefits, that's the way we approach the concept of operating cost of a collection. We also address the issue that agency missions can include programmatic goals as well as legislative and regulatory mandates. So a lot of the behavior in collections is in response to laws or regulations. Now the definitions, we recognize 4 types of collections. Think of this as a 2x2 matrix. Project collections are those that are generally in somebody's lab. They were collected or amassed for a particular goal or a project, and they stay in that status until the project is over or somebody retires or dies. Institutional collections, in contrast, are preserved long-term, and they are the property of an institution. They're not managed and held by an individual, but by the institution. They're managed and preserved for long-term use by a wide audience, not just the people who collected them. So project versus institutional collections is the major cut. Renewable and non-renewable collections is much more straightforward. Non-renewable collections are unique objects. They're dead, they're not reproducing, they're unique, they can't be replaced. And so destructive sampling is a big management issue. Do you use up the last little bit of a sample in an analysis knowing that that's the last bite at the apple? Renewable collections, on the other hand, are self-perpetuating or can be perpetuated. Sometimes they are manufactured standard items. And I'll give one example, that you can produce more and they are essentially identical with respect to their properties, or they're plants or microbes that can be reproduced, animals also. So they are renewable collections that can be reproduced, and destructive sampling is not an issue for them. Given the four categories of collections that I just described and the tremendous breadth of types of collections and types of preservation, the working group fairly quickly agreed on 6 core services that all collections may serve, may provide to users. And you'll recognize these culture collections do exactly these things. You accession material into a collection. That's usually just a legal transfer of ownership. Sometimes it occurs at the same time that physical possession changes hands. Second, we preserve and maintain the contents of the collections. Now, third, we document the holdings and begin to disseminate the information. Now, accessioning is usually accompanied by a transfer of very basic information. Sometimes it's not down to the item level. It may be just a description of the group of objects that are being transferred. Documentation really speaks to the individual items in the collection. Fourth is providing access to qualified users. This is putting things up on the web, visitor programs, loan programs, sales programs, if something is sold as a commodity. Fifth is data curation. This is something that's really much newer in our thinking, the process of correcting errors, error trapping and correcting, adding metadata to the records of individual items in the collection, linking the object records in a database to publications and online data. The Global Collection, Culture Collection Network, for example, has a very advanced system where you can search holdings, you can search accessions by the traits of the individual strains. It makes them more discoverable. It makes the database and online websites much more useful, and it extends the reach of the collection. Finally, some collections also provide services related to education and outreach to raise public understanding and support for collections. So when we approached the question of how do we estimate operating costs, we recognize that institutional collections can offer just one or two of the basic services. Accessioning and preserving are the two most basic services, but some collections, many collections, provide 5 or 6 of those services. These services are not applicable to project collections. Remember, these are held and used and managed by the researchers who collect them, who collected them and are using them. So they might have a much more liberal approach to destructive sampling because it's not an institutional collection. So they may use up the entire specimen in a collection, and they're not bound by institutional policies. So everything I'm going to say about operating costs applies to institutional collections, not to project collections. The per unit costs of operating an institutional collection is going to vary, obviously, by the number and the amount of services provided. If you just offer the basic archive or accessioning and preserving, then it's much less expensive per unit than if you went into data curation and large-scale digitization to increase user access. The size and type of the collections and the preservation obviously will affect per unit costs. You are in a world of the most expensive type of preservation. Geographic location will affect the cost of space and salaries. And in the federal agency, the way the agency budgets may have an impact. That is, some things may be centrally funded, like building security or utilities, and so a collection never has to pay for those. So that's another source of variation. But the primary variations are going to be the type of preservation, the size of the collection, because that affects economies of scale, and the number and the amount of services provided. This list of standard services provides collections with a standard framework for reconstructing the operating budgets, and the report goes into some detail about how you would actually use the framework to basically reverse engineer the way costs are accrued so that you can come up with an estimate of per unit costs. And finally, we really want to stress that in the government, somebody might well ask, like the Office of Management and Budget, how do your costs compare to other types of costs? Benchmarking costs across collections only makes sense in the context of the services that are provided and the types of preservation. So we cannot come up with a meaningful average cost for a specimen in a federal collection. The most interesting part of the report that took most of the effort was to settle on these 5 methods for estimating benefits. You'll recognize some. I hope that some of them will be new to you. I'll go into each one in detail. Let me introduce them to you and some of the jargon that we attach to it. So the first one, the formal name we selected was technology and knowledge transfer, but we think of them in the working group, we thought of those as value chains. And the examples in the report, we have 3, the USDA National Plant Germplasm and the ARS culture collections, both of which are renewable collections, and the CDC National Health and Nutrition Survey called NHANES. Those are biomedical samples, which are, there's certain parts of them like DNA extracts that can be reproduced and are renewable, but for the most part, they are blood serum and urine samples, and a lot of it attached metadata from physical exams that are non-renewable. The second method we call success stories, but economists also often refer to them as winning lottery tickets. And the case study there comes from the Yellowstone National Park microbes in Hot Springs and how they were involved in the creation and in the development of the PCR technique. So that's partly ATCC, which was largely federally funded at that time, and the National Park Service. The third technique we called option values. You can think of that as insurance policies, or option in the sense that a Hollywood studio might buy the options for a novel so that they could then develop it into a movie at some later date. The example there are 2 collections from Food and Drug Administration, especially the foodborne bacteria collection, which is one of the world's largest, or perhaps the largest. The fourth collection, fourth method, we termed value added by users, but you can think of it as co-investments. Very interesting one and highly relevant to natural history collections and perhaps to culture collections as well. The example there comes from geology, the U.S. Geological Survey's Core Research Center in Denver, Colorado. And finally, a method that is well known to economists, but was completely new to us, was counterfactual scenarios. And I termed these, for purposes of discussion, It's a Wonderful Life, based on the Frank Capra movie, It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart, one of my favorites, in which his guardian angel lets him see what the world would have been like if he had never been born. Counterfactual scenarios rest on gathering data from users about what they would have done, what it would have cost them if the collection didn't exist. The examples here are the reference collections that are used by USDA border inspectors to stop the import of agricultural pests and invasive species, and the standard reference materials that are sold by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The standard reference materials are a renewable collection. The APHIS border collections. In fact, most of the others are, except for the culture collections, are non-renewable collections. Let me dive into the first one, value chains. Something in a collection provides some data or provides a gene sequence, provides some material that is then refined into a product. It also would include bio-inspired designs. Example, microstructures on a leaf that gave rise to some nanoparticles that's used in auto body paint. But in our discussion of how do you document and estimate the value generated with this method, we have to recognize that the collection can only be the starting point or one component in a long value chain, and there are many other sources leading to an innovation and a marketable product. How do you partition it? How do you partition the eventual cash flow, the market value of the invention of the product? How do you partition among all those links in the value chain? It's hard to document. You have to wait a long time after the initial use of the collection. So there are delays in developing the product and marketing it. And you have all of these multiple components that contributed to the value chain. USDA publishes an annual tech transfer report with lots of reports about the use of the collection by plant breeders or industrial users. In the case of the culture collection, the tech transfer reports by USDA never venture into the question of what the eventual market value of the discovery was and how much can be attributed to the collection. NHANES, the National Health Survey collection, is heavily used by people who are developing vaccines and other drugs because they need a statistical sample to find out what is the presence in the population of a particular antibody, for example. So it's very important in determining how a medication is used, but it's only one part in the very long and expensive value chain of developing vaccines or other medications. Second approach is a success story, the winning lottery ticket. Economists are very quick to point out that these are rare events in which collections may play a pivotal role, but they're often unanticipated, which means that even though there may be an enormous payoff in terms of market value or socioeconomic impact, you can't predict when they'll happen, you can't predict how much they'll be worth, and in some cases, the use of the collection, the object in the collection, has little to do with what the collection was meant to do. It may be serendipitous. So the impact may be indirect, they'll always be delayed, and it's hard to trace causality. Yet the microbe that was eventually used as a key element in the polymerase chain reaction is a great example, spawning a multi-billion-dollar market every year, but it was really just one part of that process. And I'll talk about what the strengths and weaknesses of these in a moment. The option value is very interesting. I always think of collections as having two nightmare scenarios. The first nightmare scenario is you had something of incredible value and importance, and you discovered later when somebody needed it that you had thrown it away. The other one is that you have something in the collection that's a no-no, you shouldn't have it, you didn't really have a right to own it, or for some reason you don't want it in your collection. But I'm going to talk about the first one, the insurance policy, the thing that you might need someday and you have to hold on to it. And these are the plant germplasm system, where in case of crop failure, you need to have substitutes ready. You need to be able to develop plants that are resistant to drought, to salt water, to a particular agricultural pest, to a disease vector. So you keep these on hand to draw on in case of emergencies. Foodborne pathogens, very similar. When there's an outbreak in a foodborne pathogen, state departments of health will want to be able to compare it against other strains to find out where did it come from, how can we trace it back to its source and stop it. So hard to predict, but it is relatively easy to amass data on how it was used by departments of health. You can know from history what those outbreaks in the past cost in terms of lost productivity, lost health, death. And so you can make an indirect argument about we keep these around in order to avoid these kinds of future costs. Value added by users, I'm going to take a few extra minutes on this because it is so new to so many people. We called it co-investment because users invest time and money in the samples they access. They do data curation, they find errors in the data. So it's an unpaid service that they improve the data and the metadata of the collection. They do analyses, they produce analytical data. They take images, they prepare specimens like rock thin sections from a core or DNA extract. So they produce a usable object, all of which will increase the downstream use, discoverability, searchability of the database. And the USGS Core Research Center gets rock cores partly from USGS intramural research and a lot of it donated by oil companies. When they've finished with them and they can no longer justify the cost of storing them, they give them to the USGS. USGS charges no user fees. They have a very aggressive campaign to get users interested in the collection, and they feel that user costs might dissuade some users. But in return for access they provide at no cost, users are required to provide all the analytical data that they generate, thin sections that they produced or duplicates of thin sections, and links to the publications and PDFs of the publications, which are public domain because of the use of a federal collection, all within a certain time limit. And they must return these value adds in a certain period of time at the risk of being banned from further use of the collection. So it's kind of a tough love user fee, but it sets up a virtuous cycle where the users are getting something from it, but they're giving back, they're paying it forward. The collection incorporates everything they generate, then that increases the value and use of the collection in the future. CDC's NHANES, the collection I spoke about before, also curates analytical results. They ingest it into the database to enrich the searchability of the online resource. But that raised the question, has anybody looked at the distribution over time of user co-investment? That is, are they only interested in the things that are added to the collection recently? And do they lose interest after a time, or do they continue to attract interest? So we gathered data sets from the Core Research Center, USGS, and all the departments at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History. They began having digital loan records in the 1960s. So we looked at those, and I'm going to present one, the best data set, that is the most complete data set. The other data sets tell the same story. The other departments at the Museum of Natural History tell the same story. And the story in both cases is that objects retain their interest of users over time, which means that the value added through co-investment can continue to accumulate for a very long time, regardless of when the collection was made or when it was accessioned into the collection. So here's the USGS core. The upper histogram, the red bars show accessions when did the cores become part of the collection. The green line is the cost of oil per barrel, and you see that those years when the cost of oil dropped, oil companies got rid of their cores because they didn't want to pay for it, and when the cost of oil is high, they kept them. The bottom histogram shows the distribution of the ages of collections, the age of cores, or the accession date of cores, over a 2-year period. So users borrowed samples or got samples from the period 2016 to 2018, and the date of accession for those cores is shown. And you can see that the two have the same shape, which means that even as recently as 2018, people were asking for core samples that go back to the beginning of the collection. This is a different diagram. This is for the Department of Invertebrate Zoology. They had the largest data set of all the departments, and it goes back the furthest. So the vertical axis is the collecting date. When was a sample collected? And the horizontal axis is when was it requested? When did it go out on loan? So going back to the beginning of the loan program that was digitized, 1965, you'll see those samples that were requested are in the first part of the century, 50 years before. And even now, as the density of points gets much higher, you can see that people have been requesting samples going back to the very earliest ones in the collection when the Smithsonian was created in the middle of the 1800s. The fifth approach is counterfactual scenarios. That's It's a Wonderful Life. What would you do if we didn't have these collections? NIST has these more than 1,000 things that it sells to private industry and also private industry instrument developers who want to be able to calibrate the instruments that they sell, and users who need to continue to calibrate their instruments and to prove that they are within tolerable limits. These obviously are very important for anybody who's producing something that has to meet a federal standard. You need to be able to point to calibration standards you used for your instruments. So the question is, if you're, the fun example is peanut butter. There are the definition, a federal regulatory definition of peanut butter and limits of sugar and all sorts of things, and you have to buy the NIST peanut butter samples to calibrate your instrument. If you sold peanut butter, how would you meet the federal standard if you didn't have the NIST collection to buy? And they do it by a survey. They just go out and they ask users, how much delay, how much money, what kind of workaround would you have had to use to come up with a way to show that you comply with federal standards? The plant protection and quarantine system had a different approach. When something comes in, let's say a cargo ship with peas on it, with some kind of plant, they inspect a small percentage. If they find something that looks like a pest, now they have to decide, is it harmless, or is it potentially harmful but can be treated, or is it harmful and can't be treated? The collections allow them to categorize them. So if something is infected but harmless, they can let it in. Or if it's in the second category, they can treat it and let it in. If it's in the third category, they have to destroy it or turn it back. If they didn't have the collections to make that determination, they would have to reject everything that had anything that looked odd on it. And now you can calculate, and they did calculate, the value of the things that would have been destroyed or turned away because it was in the harmless category or the harmful but treatable category. So that's the delta that was made marketable because of the collection. I won't go into this, but the report has advantages and disadvantages of each of the 5 methods. The findings and recommendations are fairly straightforward. The services are important because they preserving, for example, preserving and maintaining extends the useful life of the objects. User access and data curation expands the pool of potential users. Data curation can create this virtual cycle of co-investment, and education and outreach, the benefits there are obvious. The second major finding, accessioning and preserving can be very expensive, and therefore they can act to limit the support available for other services. If you have too active an accessioning program, too active growth program, and you want to preserve things in an acceptable way, it can squeeze out support for other things. Finally, this framework of the interlocking services, costs, and benefits, that is, you have to provide certain services if you hope to generate certain types of benefits, can create a framework for evidence-based management and decision-making. Agencies are now in the process of discussing the costs, the pros and cons of these different methods. Certainly the method they pick has to fit their mission and the type of collection they have, but also an appreciation for the stakeholder audience. Are they going to like surveys, or don't they like surveys? Would they prefer programmatic data? Is qualitative benefits all right, or will they want a quantitative approach? And finally, do they want data about retrospective benefits that have been generated or potential benefits in the future, such as the option value insurance policies talks about prospective value. Finally, the counterfactual scenarios often rely on user surveys, but federal agencies have a limit on how much they can harass non-federal people to fill out surveys. So that's something that we have to deal with. You'll be getting a copy, or you have a copy accessible of the report, so I won't go into the acknowledgments. The members, by the way, there were about 30 members of the working group, all feds, and these are the presenters, some of whom are non-feds, and the people who help support it. This last slide provides you with links to the background information. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention. Scott and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, David and Scott, for that great presentation. We will now be heading into a Q&A session. So if you have a question or a comment for Scott or David, we invite you to type that into the questions section of the control panel, and we will moderate the Q&A session. While we're waiting for those questions to be typed in, I just want to draw your attention to the chat section of the control panel. There we have posted a number of websites and resources, both for the organizations who are co-hosting this webinar, but also websites that are in this final slide that they provided. So take a moment to visit that chat section and look at those links that we've provided. So we have a couple of questions. The first one being, what do you think of the application of ISO 2387 to collections of microbial cultures?
I'm not sure who that's for. I followed the ISO standards more closely through a project that ended a while ago. I know that ISO certification is not an easy process. It's not straightforward. It really takes a commitment. I'm unaware of the latest of what the limitations that might be placed on culture collections in terms of downstream use. Is it sort of like a regulatory standard that in order for somebody to use a culture collection, it really has to show that it has applied to ISO standards, but I can't speak with any knowledge about the particular ISO standard.
Yeah, the same with me. I have not followed that particular discussion lately. And, you know, in general, ISO standards are a good thing, but the devil's in the details sometimes in their application.
Evidently, the ISO standard being referenced here is for biobanking.
No, I know that ISBR has been a real leader in discussions about ISO standards for biobanking. It's certainly, if it's human biobanking, of course, that's got a real tangle in terms of privacy and ethics. So I feel the pain of any organization that goes through the ISO certification process, but I don't know whether this is strictly a process standard or if it is a sort of content quality control standard.
Okay. Okay, the next question is, what are the next steps? How can repositories use this information, and will there be community efforts to respond?
Well, this is now one of the to-do items for the interagency working group. Now that the report is out, there will be webinars that disseminate this kind of information beyond the members of IWGSC. There's about 70 or 80 representatives of agencies. It's now in their hands to gather discussion opportunities in their agencies. USDA, the Office of Chief Scientist, is organizing a webinar. What the IWGSC will be doing is bringing back the case studies of how have the agencies attempted to document costs and benefits. Very few of them. In the Green Report, one of the questions asked was, how well do you know what it costs to operate the collections? And a very small percentage knew. And that gave rise to, when we found that in the survey, in writing the Green Report, we highlighted that as one of the recommendations that led to this report. So I'm sure that there will be agencies that bring in their budget people and saying, we need to sit down and have a prolonged discussion about whether this report suggests a way forward. I feel sure it does. So we have roughly 15 departments and agencies in the IWGSC. Will be intensively looking at this, and one of the recommendations in the report is that we share the ongoing discussions with the non-federal sector and invite case studies and presentations from outside. So I guess there's a chance we'll be flooded with interest. That's a problem I'd like to have, but I think that we can look forward to presentations at the interagency working group by culture collections who say, this is how we do it, this is where we're stuck, or we think we have something really special that you'd like to see. So we have, I think, an open door policy about exchange of information with the non-federal sector.
And I'll just expand a little bit on the issue David raised of many collections not actually having a good handle on their operating costs, and that's something that we found in the federal sector, and I believe the same exists in many cases in the private sector collections as well. And the reason is that oftentimes many of what are really core operating costs of the collections are covered on the backs of research programs. So they're actually in research budgets, not collections budgets. And so they don't, things like the time of staff who's paid out of a research project is not fully sort of accounted for in the collections operating costs. And you know, there's a variety of ways to compensate for that many collections are now doing.
Okay, next question. Do you have any advice on how to make a collection more bioeconomic driven?
I'll leave that to Scott. He's been involved in the bioeconomy issue.
Well, I think the issue with the bioeconomy is even kind of understanding what it is, and the way that the National Academy and the White House Science Office are describing it. The bioeconomy is very broad, and really all connection, all of the contribution of biology to the economy. And as such, I think it's just important to keep reminding folks and demonstrating through case studies and other things the value of these biological collections in those processes. And some of those values are obvious. Some of them are not so obvious. And some of the examples that David gave of things like the value of collections in providing identifications that prevent the spread of plant pests of various natures are not always taken into account in thinking about these things. So it's that constant process of demonstrating the value of these collections and the need to support them. And I think that is actually a critical thing at this particular time, because with the economic problems that COVID has brought on, we know that many nonprofit organizations, many state universities, and other organizations are facing severe budget shortfalls, and that's having a severe impact, or will in the future have a severe impact, on many of our scientific collections. And so this is a critical time to be able to demonstrate your long-term value and the importance of that support.
Let me just follow up on that last point that Scott made. It's an opportunity for me to pitch once again, the importance of data curation, being able to capture publications, data sets that have been published. Capturing that information allows you to take a broad look at what the collection's reach is. And then it's a problem of just comparing those to the topics that are now being discussed as what's the bioeconomy, what does it include? So assessing what impact you're already having on this domain.
Okay, our next attendee asks, do you recommend that microbe collections do some type of economic analysis to explore value of their collection? And how might that process start for a collection who has never done a business plan?
Yeah, I think of culture collections as probably the greatest potential for economic analysis, depending on, again, the stakeholder that you have in mind. What kind of story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a retrospective one or a prospective one? Do you want it to be in dollars and cents and a cost-benefit ratio? Or do you want it to be more impressionistic? So what message are you trying to convey? But culture collections, I think, are in the best position because you have the ability to generate or to promote user access so well, because you know the characteristics of your accessions better than almost any other group. That is, the ratio of data to accessions is very high, partly because of quality control. You have to analyze strains to make sure that it's still the right thing, and that allows you to provide searchable databases of your holdings. Then you can connect, well, okay, you knew exactly what you were getting. How are you using this? If you can capture the co-investment, how are you using it? What have you produced with it? As a first step, looking at the downstream outputs of your users, then you can sit back and say, well, does this lend itself to more of well, people do this under emergency circumstances. They're trying to solve a crisis problem and therefore it suggests the option value. People are using you as an insurance policy to solve a problem when it arises. Or they might be using it in commercial development, research and development, in which case you might lean more towards a tech transfer story, a value chain story. So the first step in all of these is to get a good broad view of your users, their uses, and the outputs and outcomes they're generating.
Okay, thank you. We have just a few more minutes remaining, and we have 3 more questions. So let's see if we can get through the final 3. So the next one is, how could we classify in terms of benefits other services provided by some microalgal culture collections, such as large-scale cultivation and genomic analysis?
Could you repeat the first part of the question?
How could we classify the benefits of the other services provided by some microalgal culture collections, such as large-scale cultivation and genomic analysis?
Yeah, those, the large-scale cultivation, I assume, is related to biofuels. I'm not sure what the other uses of large-scale propagation would be. That's being done for potential market development, I assume. Genetic analysis is such an important part of co-investment and increasing use. So the way I would document that is to just go to look at your user requests or the sales or the accessing different strains. Do they go back in time, that analysis I showed of comparing when users, the history of user requests, are they requesting young things that were recently accessioned or very old things? And that gives you a snapshot of how much impact, how much interest there is in the collection across ages. And then linking it to what are they using it for? So very old things being used for very new applications is a wonderful story to tell, what's going on there. So that's the way I would begin, is looking at the loan or sales records, the age distribution, and connecting that to what use they're making of it. I hope that addresses the question.
Okay, and the final question we'll have time for today is, what do you think could be done to guarantee financial sustainability of biobanks? If possible, can you recommend a model to adapt?
Yes, I had a fantastic Zoom call with a member of the Culture Collection Network, and she knows who she is. And I hope that this is Jean, and I haven't drilled down into the details of the economic model, but the balance of knowing what things cost, knowing what the interest is, generating interest through incredible transparency, making data, metadata, results, co-investment, making all of that available is just providing so much value to the collection, to the user community, that and pricing things appropriately is just generating a good solid financial base, as far as I can tell. So I hope that Jean will share its knowledge base with the group, and I'm very interested in learning more about Jean.
And I'll just add, coming at it from the actual uses of a particular collection and balancing the budget and of that particular collection is obviously the best way to go. But when justifying budgets, base budgets in an institutional context, linking to that recognition that these collections are recognized as distributed infrastructure that supports research and development nationally, can also be useful.
Yeah. Let me just add one more maybe it's an obvious point. Sustainability requires an understanding of operating costs, and the breakdown of services is, we think, essential to know what you're spending on growth rate, on accessions, and basic functions such as preservation and attracting users. And if you don't have those data, the nightmare scenario for many collections is they just had an open door policy. They were supply driven. There was so much stuff that showed up on their doorstep, and they very kindly took it in, and they became swamped with the costs of accessioning and preserving and maintaining, and it didn't allow them to attract users and serve the needs of users, and they went into a death spiral, and so that's lesson one that I hope collections take seriously.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. A special thank you to David and Scott for joining us for the webinar today. What a great presentation and a great discussion. Thank you to all of the attendees who attended and asked great questions. Thank you for everybody, and we hope everybody has a great day.
Dusty, I put my email in the chat. I hope you'll distribute it.
Great, yes. So we will, if everyone has a final moment to visit that chat section of the control panel, if you have additional questions, David has posted his email.
I only have the option of sending it to organizers and panelists. I can't communicate with all the attendees. So could you repost that, please?
You don't have all?
Yeah, my drop down only includes organizers and panelists.
It should be the very, very top. See if you can scroll up. It should say all entire audience, but we'll get it posted. Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not
yes.
there.
Okay. Yes, it's already been posted in the chat.
Great.
So thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time and attention today.
Thank you.